Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Przemysław Gasztold. I'm an employee for the Historical Research Bureau of INR. And the aim of my lecture today is to present the relationships between international terrorism and the intelligence service during the Polish People's Republic, the PPR, and the Cold War. My lecture will involve several aspects. First, I will present certain information regarding the national internal terrorism which took place during the PPR, and then I will move on to certain examples of the contacts, relationships between the PPR and the international terrorism starting from the first half of 1960s, and then I will discuss the causes, the reasons for which the Eastern Bloc started the relationships, operational, intelligence, logistic relationships with different terrorist groupings that operated during the Cold War, especially in 1970s and 1980s. At the end, I will try to sum up all these aspects to show these relationships and its effects. To start with the first aspect, I would like to pay attention to the national internal terrorism which took place in the PPR. The fact is that the PPR propaganda for many years was trying to discourage the opposition using accusational measures, accusing this group or movement of using terrorist measures. This tactics was used, for example, after the Second World War, when the communist authorities were trying to fight with underground authorities, and this independence grouping were considered terrorist. So in this case, the authorities were trying to show that anyone who was trying to fight against Moscow authorities was a terrorist. And this narrative until the end of PPR did not change, whether it was 1960s or 70s, especially 80s. Here, the operation of certain solidarity wings were considered terrorist, especially during the legal operation of solidarity or during the martial law. And the authorities were trying to justify the introduction of the martial law by the fact that this independent trade union solidarity somehow was trying to prepare to overthrow the communist authorities to use terrorist measures, which actually was not confirmed in the documents or in the operation of this solidarity movement, but it was a kind of sort of rhetoric model to somehow accuse this solidarity of this act. Starting with the examples, if someone asked the question whether in the PPR there were examples of terrorism, whether grouping of people were trying to use terrorism to overthrow the authorities, the answer would not be clear or unambiguous, because terrorism had never been the major tool in the operation, in the political operation of any grouping after the war. However, there were certain examples which confirmed the thesis that terrorist associations actually took place. And as evidence, we can give an example from 1959, when Stanisław Jaros prepared assassination against the cavalcade of cars with Władysław Gomułka and Nikita Khrushchev on board. This bomb planted there exploded, but nobody suffered. I mean, the passengers, and from that moment, the security service started investigation to find out who was responsible for this association. In 1961, Stanisław Jaros did it again because he had not been captured for these 2 years, and his goal was again the cavalcade of cars with only Gomułka on board. And this bomb exploded again, but Gomułka again survived. because it exploded at the time when, not at the time when the car was passing by, but there was just one person who actually died, and here SB had to find out who was responsible for this assassination, which was Stanisław Jaros. Of course, he was heard and sentenced to death, which happened in 1960. The case of Jaros is a kind of model example that such single cases of terrorism took place. When we go further, to, for example, 1970s. Here we have an incident when Andrzej Szewczowaniec planted a bomb under the memorial of Lenin in Nowa Huta. The bomb exploded, but didn't totally destroy the memorial of Lenin. Another example of brothers Kowalczyk, who also planted a bomb under the Higher School of Pedagogy in Opole one day before the academy to commemorate the civil police. The bomb was planted at night and the hall was destroyed. However, there were no injured people. It was quite crucial because it was a sort of demonstration to show that not everyone agrees or gives consent to communism. Of course, the people were arrested and then and imprisoned. From these categories of terrorism, it is worth mentioning the operation of fighting solidarity, which in the 1918s, as opposed to the underground solidarity, thought that with the brutality of the authorities against the civilians or violation, they are going to use certain terrorist measures. So if the authorities were going to be more brutal, they also considered using violence. And we know from the history that there were many such cases. For example, burning certain dacha belonging to the higher authorities, or planting bomb at the Polish United Workers' Party. One of the members of the Solidarity planted such a bomb under the door of the committee, his own bomb, his production bomb. But it was planted in the evening to minimize the risk of any deaths. Of course, the security service was trying to find out who had planted this bomb. However, they failed to find out about it. Of course, we have many more such examples, but what connects all of them is trying to minimize the victims. So if they planted any bomb under any party building or security service building, they usually did it in the evening or at night to minimize injured people. And here an important role was played by both the Catholic Church and, especially after 1980s, the leaders of underground solidarity, because these two institutions put a lot of emphasis on striving for changes, fighting for democracy, human rights, and they wanted that to happen in a peaceful way. So both the church and underground solidarity refused to use violence, terrorism as a measure to gain a political goal. And here I would also would like to mention to compare that to CIA after the martial law had been introduced, because the intelligence service were considering whether Solidarity should receive weapons from the US, as it happened in the case of the Afghans when the Soviet Union invaded the Afghanistan, but then they thought that it would be a wrong decision because it would increase the repression of the system, and then CIA helped Solidarity in a different way by delivering certain materials necessary for printing of illegal newspapers, leaflets, which was quite important for the lasting of solidarity in the 1980s. Another story that I think should be mentioned is a story regarding the so-called air terrorism, because the authorities oftentimes considered it the biggest danger. And when we look at the statistics, we can notice that from 1960s until 1990s, there were a lot of air terrorist cases. I would say over 10 or even dozens of cases, depending how we qualify different incidents, which means that airplanes were kidnapped in the PPR, but none of this kidnapping was of political nature, because it was really hard to gain a passport to live abroad. And that's why many people decided to kidnap a plane and direct the plane under a threat to use violence against passengers or a pilot to the west, whether it was Berlin, Western Berlin, or Austria, or Denmark. And we had a lot of such cases. They also had certain repercussions in terms of increasing this counter-terrorist security measures. Then they created the first counter-terrorist unit, and these people were delegated to this unit, and then their goal was to protect the planes against kidnapping. But all these stories had a few common points. First of all, they were not kidnapping of political nature, and usually when they accomplished the goal, when people managed to escape to the West, they had a possibility to stay in the West, or they could return to Poland. But in most cases, these passengers stayed in the West. There is even a funny abbreviation, how to decipher the LOT abbreviation, the Polish Airlines. And in Germany, they say that it's landing on Tempelhof. So here, both this national terrorism and air terrorism were not of political nature. They were not used by groupings or other oppositional movements. But despite this, the authorities were trying to threaten with terrorism, which was crucial during the martial law, which was to justify that solidarity. For example, KPN was trying to gain weapon and to overthrow communism. So the authorities then were trying to organize a special press conference, a kind of exhibition of weapons, so that, to show that they took over the weapons from the opposition. And this exhibition was organized, and you could see there are certain clubs, catapults, of leaflets, which were thrown from the top of the buildings, and then they went to different places on the street. And it was supposed to be a kind of evidence that Solidarity was an terrorist organization, that they were using terrorist methods. However, it was not evidenced in their operational practice. And at the same time, when the authorities were accusing of many organizations that they were using terrorist methods, communist services kept real relationships, operational intelligence, political relationships with different terrorist groupings, for example, international groupings, which operated both in the Middle East and in the west of Europe. And here, the genesis of these relationships of the PPR services, intelligence service, with, for example, the organizations for the liberation of Palestine, because let's remember that these organizations ceased to use terrorism. They somehow remised terrorism in different wings. Of course, in different wings of this organization was still observed, but they, in the majority, they tried to remise this terrorism, and they were considered an international organization in the West, but in the Eastern Bloc, it was an organization considered national liberation organization using certain methods which were not well seen, but they couldn't say that it was strictly terrorist organization. And here, the example was the Six-Day War, when the Israeli army attacked the Syrian army and the Egyptian army and destroyed the whole aviation of those two countries. The aviation mainly based on armed weapons, and at that time we could say that the Palestinians who wanted to create their own state, their own country, they helped the neighboring countries for help, and they thought that they needed to take this act into their own hands because the failure of the Arabian countries in the Six-Day War made a lot of countries aware that the future of the Palestinians is in their own hands, so they had to on their own strive for independence. And therefore, after 1967, a lot of new groupings started to be formed, and we could mention here, for example, the People's Liberation Front of Palestine, who kidnapped many planes, which kidnapped many Israelis, or the so-called OLP of Arafat, and many first contact between the Polish representatives and representatives of the Palestinians took place in the Lebanon. They were not of political nature, but actually of intelligence nature, because in 1969 and to the Lebanon, the representative of Al-Fatah came and he asked for the collaboration. Of course, the representative of the PPR, then it was the Colonel Tomaszewski, pseudonym Jacques, he sent there a telegram to Warsaw whether this collaboration was possible, and he received a consent. So the first relationship from the 1969 were based on the delivery of weapons, because the Palestinians had a lot of money. We forget about this, but the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine, as a national liberation organization, had a budget which consisted of over $1 billion, and in this way they could support the fight with Israel. And the Palestinians had money, they had dollars, and what they needed weapon. Of course, the Western countries didn't want to sell this to them, but the Eastern Bloc thought that it would be a good possibility to somehow increase the collaboration, so they tried to strengthen this relationship, and the PPR was not an exception here, because both the discussions in the 1960s were also conducted between Hungary, Romania, the Czech Republic, and also with the Soviet Union, which went out of this contacts based on selling weapons, and they also tried to use the front for the liberation of Palestine to conduct offensive activities. And Wadia Havak was registered by KGB as an agent under the pseudonym of nationality. And in this 1960s is a kind of censorship of starting these relationships, and over the ages these contacts became closer and closer, especially regarding weapon trade, because Poland was able to receive a lot of foreign currency, not only Al-Fatah but also the Organization for the Liberation of Palestine,
and many other organizations which don't exist anymore, who were receivers of those weapons, which was paid in currency. Of course, in parallel, there were also discussions of a political nature, And what Palestinians especially cared about were their stipends for Palestinians in Poland. There was also an eagerness to use the Eastern Bloc countries as a certain place of freedom, of absconding, running away, and reposing after actions or activities. So there are many disclosed files and documents where there were these written and unwritten agreements. For example, the authorities of the Polish People's Republic, they guaranteed stipends. First, they studied in Łódź in the school of Polish language to learn the basics of Polish language, and then they were sent to technical universities and to universities. Some of them did not complete those studies because they weren't really interested in studying, and the stipends in the Polish People's Republic, there was an opportunity to receive, to rest, to receive stipends, monthly stipends, which sometimes amounted to $100. $100 of a monthly stipend for a student at that time was a lot in the 1970s and 80s. If we take into consideration that the average salary at that time was about the equivalent of $25. So many of these Palestinian students having various nationalities, whether it's Iraqi, Jordanian, Syrian, Lebanese, lived at a very high level in the Polish People's Republic and were not always so keen on with their studies. Except for that cooperation, educational cooperation, there was also increasing closer political cooperation. Because in 1976, the authorities of the People's Republic of Poland had creating a quasi-political affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this quasi-diplomatic status was raised in 1982 after the invasion of the Israeli army to Lebanon, and then they received the full diplomatic privileges at that time they were granted. So here we should note a certain difference in the PPR, because compared to other countries of the Eastern Bloc, they were not so close. Where Yasser Arafat visited communist Eastern Germany or the Soviet Union, I think he was only twice in Poland in the PPR. There were several reasons for that, and I will come back to them. So I think that it would be worthy of noting that in the 1970s and 80s, that cooperation was mainly based on weapons, sending weapons, because the possibility of the weapons trade during the Cold War was strongly limited for the armaments industry of the PPR, because you could export weapons where they could be paid for with currency. So Western countries did not buy them. There was no consent to send weapons there, but to obtain foreign currency, you had to expand this possibility of sales. So there was Syria, Libya, Iraq, which were very eager to purchase PPR, and they paid in currency, including India also, who paid in currency and purchased a lot of weapons. Iraq, Libya, or Syria were therefore countries at that time considered by the State Department as supporting international terrorism. We know that those countries such Hafiz al-Assad, Syria, or Iraq of Saddam Hussein used terrorist organizations for various purposes, for example, for killing their political opponents. And these countries also supported other organizations very known in the 1980s, like the Abu Nidal organization, which separated in 1971 from Al-Fatah, and Al-Banna, Sabri al-Banna, who was known as under the alias Abu Nidal. So this was the Al-Qaeda of the 1980s, which was responsible for attacks in over 22 countries where 900 individuals were either injured or killed. So this organization, Abu Nidal, had very close relations with military intelligence services of the Polish People's Republic. And why? Because it was about business, it was about weapons trade, because that organization was supported by Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Libya, and they were the receivers of the most of Polish weaponry. So to support those organizations, the Abu Nidal organization was an intermediary in the trade of Polish weapons. So when Warsaw wanted to chronologically send weapons to Syria, Iraq, and Libya, the intermediary in those million-level contracts was a representative of the Abu Nidal organization. So if the contract was $100 million, then the commission could have been from 1.5% to 3% to 5%, which made it landed in the accounts of the Abu Nidal organization. So the disclosed files, confidential files, indicate that that was the case, and the military services knew that Abu Nidal was the intermediary in these types of relations. Why the military services? Because weapons trade during the PPR was protected by a counterintelligence, by the WSW, the internal military or counter reconnaissance, and also the head command, military head command. So we come back once again to the military intelligence, which had these contacts with the Abu Nidal organization. We know very well that the cooperation was so good that in Abu Nidal set up SAS LLC Limited, and the Panama Papers, which disclosed this. You could find the documents that leaked. You could find information about the SIS company, which used the Regan Mossack law firm in Panama in order to hide those financials relations and money laundering, which was funds which were received based on that commission. So after the company SIS was set up, the head offices of SIS was established in Warsaw, in Intraco, on the 25th floor, and the Intraco building on Stawka Street. This was rare because, let's say, a terrorist organization, a wing company of the terrorist organization, could be placed and had head of offices in Warsaw. Abu Nidal and the head of this wing, financial wing, and the individual who contacted with the PPR was Samir Najmedi, who contacted authorities of PPR. He had a flat in Anin district in Warsaw, had very good relations with the higher spheres and establishment at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Central Office of Engineering, which the only practical institution during the PPR which could export weapons from Poland. So many documents indicate that Samir Najmedi also maintained these relations, official, unofficial, corrupted representatives of the communist authorities, in order to use those contracts resulting from weapons trade to finance terrorist organizations. So I think what's interesting is that these types of relationships were not not visible for Western intelligence or American intelligence. For example, the American embassy in the placed emphasis or pressure to sever those relations on the PPR. The CIA knew that the military authorities were conducting certain shady business with terrorist organizations as part of the Abu Nidal organization. At this approximately at the same time, similar relations between the military intelligence and Moser al-Qassar were concluded. Here, Moser al-Qassar is also worthy of mention because in the 70s and 80s, he's one of the biggest private weapons traders worldwide. His contacts with Tanzir, who were established in the 1970s, where at the commissioning of southern Yemen, he exported weapons produced in Poland, mainly Kalashnikovs from Radom, ammunition and grenades. So Moser al-Qassar, the cooperation with him was going so well that in 1983 Moser proposes Tenzin to create a joint venture company, a common company which would coordinate that weapons trade, and wanted to locate it and establish it in Marbella in Spain, where he had his palace and had his head offices. So the entire concept was discussed at the level of in Tenzin and also in the general command, and it was undertaken. That means Tenzin delegated 2 employees to the new company, which was called Al-Kastronik, and there were 2 representatives of the second board, so 2 military intelligence spies who were working undercover in Tenzin. So formally that company was set up not in Spain but in Austria, in Vienna, when Moser al-Qassar was also conducting his business. So during the 2 years, from 1983 to 1985, within those 2 years, the company was involved in various intermediary activity, weapons trade, including those weapons produced in the PPR, because there would be nothing strange about that, because there were many, both in the Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, were using many of these types of represents. But Moser al-Qassar, except for a weapons trader at a global level, he was also involved in terrorist activities. He was very in close contact with Abu Abbas, who was the head of the Palestinian Liberation Front, and an example of the fact that Moser al-Qassar was the Achille Lauro attack on the Italian ship in 1985. Terrorists used for that attack weapons which were produced in the Polish People's Republic. So Moser al-Qassar delivered, who with his private plane delivered those weapons, and then it was taken over by the assailants. This is an example of the fact that the military intelligence and military authorities were involved in that. The second example was the response of the Austrian authorities on the activities of Al-Qastroni. In December of 1985, the head offices of Al-Qastroni company was overtaken by the police, and those 2 spies were accused of supporting international terrorism, who were caught there, and 2 individuals who were truly sent by the military intelligence were accused by Austrian authorities that are supporting Palestinian radicals who are involved in terrorism. Of course, the company was closed, and to not create a diplomatic scandal, the 2 Poles were withdrawn quietly, discreetly from Austria, and Molkasar had to close that business. What happened? Next year, Molkasar came to Warsaw, and he opens up his own office called overseas, and continues to be involved in weapons trade here from Poland. Of course, Abu Nidal, Moser al-Qassar was monitored by the American intelligence services, and in the case of Abu Nadal, the American embassy also put a lot of pressure in this area. Vice President George Bush wrote in 1987 a private letter to General Jaruzelski where he requested that Poland, PPR, would sever its relations with terrorists. Of course, this led to the fact that in 1989 those relations were in part decreased. They were not severed because Warsaw, in a certain way, tried to be more clever than the Americans, but officially they were severed. Despite the fact in the background and back corridors, those relations were maintained in the Mozar al-Qasar, the disclosed file and documents and report from the WSE, the military intelligence, that until the beginning of the 2000s, Mozar al-Qasar was still in the interest of the military intelligence organization, and the area or level of cooperation was weapon craze. So we have Abu Nidal and Mozar al-Qasar, two organizations. Because Mozar al-Qasar, we can speak about a certain organization, cooperated with the PPR military services and intelligence. And the main area of cooperation were not ideological aspects, were not political aspects. It was business, it was weapons trade, where those officers were, Senzin was also becoming rich, and other officers were becoming rich and gaining. We don't know if those $100,000 made it to the accounts of Senzin or evaporated somewhere under the table. So these are one of the most known, described examples that the PPR intelligence supported international terrorism, because they knew about the threats, they knew also about the reservations of the American side and what kind of policy Mozar al-Qasar as well as Abu Nidal were conducting. In the case of other organizations, such as the People's Palestinian Liberation Front, also had a business nature and character, because this was said they were selling weapons from that front. However, that cooperation was not as good as in the case of Bulgaria, Romania, or the Eastern GDR. There were stipends, of course, being conducted, but they were from 3 individuals a year, where Bulgarians or GDR accepted, for example, more than dozens of students. So ideological aspects here were not that relevant. Cooperation with the OWP, as I mentioned at the beginning, was going very well, but they had reservations articulated in a different way in terms of the military intelligence with Abu Nidal. Abu Nidal fought with Yasser Arafat. These were internal Palestinian plays and fights and disputes, so there was no encouragement in that area, but the organization could not do that because the military cooperation was going well, where, for example, as an example, through Abu Jihad, who was also in Poland and establishing these relations and purchasing PPR weapons. One of the brains behind the assault on the based on Steven Spielberg's Munich film on the assailants who was shot in Hotel Victoria when he was in a cafe on the first floor, and an unidentified individual approached him and shot him 6 times. After the first shot, Abu Daw, who was a quite huge individual, he went in the direction of the assailant despite being shot many times. The case was described very quickly by foreign media and reported. This was in August of 1989. Many journalists in the West came in order to report about solidarity, and at that time it turned out that a terrorist was shot in Hotel Victoria, who is responsible for the hit on Munich, this Munich sports establishment. So at that time, the world, this was reported out into the world, and the claims or accusations in various circles in the West is that PPR is supporting international terrorism on that basis. Other examples that international terrorists were coming into Poland and were accepted was the terrorist Carlos Jaco from the 1970s and 80s, who was representing in the export of petrol. He came to Warsaw several times. The last time he was here in 1986, and from his stay in 1985, there's documentation, photo documentation, indicating that the intelligence was following him. Where in the Royal Square he was meeting with diplomats, and where they're sitting in a restaurant where they're having a party. So he was allowed to come in. He was not arrested, despite the fact that he was he was wanted in the West, but he could meet with his cooperators and colleagues here. Probably in 1986, as a result of coordination of Soviet bloc reconnaissance and intelligence services, he was blocked, and at that time he was not allowed to come into Poland. Despite the fact that he arrived at the airport, he was banned and not allowed to come in. In terms of summarizing the arrival of terrorists on our territory, there are other evidence where Rote Arben Fraktion, or the Red Army, one of the most known terrorist organization in Western Germany from 1985 to 1990. We had several generations of RAF, and in the left organizations and journals, there were also falsified documentation indicating that they were also present here and arriving here. It was difficult for Western intelligence services to confirm that they were truly coming in here, but 3 representatives of RAF were identified in Warsaw, and they created a general search for these representatives, but they were ineffective. They were catching tourists in the country would have caused more problems than simply letting them go and turning a blind eye to the fact that they were here. From other organizations which were also present on the territory of PPR, you could mention the Islamic fundamentalists, Muslim Brotherhood, who were working with fighting against communism, against like states, and other countries of the Middle East, and representatives of those organizations were also appearing in Warsaw. In the 1960s, there was an operational heist organized that they are functioning here and creating certain network of contacts. And no one was arrested. However, documentation preserved from that time indicates that such potential acts of terrorism took place. So summarizing this thread of activity of PPR services and intelligence services and unhealthy terrorism, we can indicate several points. First of all, the level of cooperation and contacts. In the case of the most closest cooperations, like with Mosul, Qasar, and Abu Nidal, were business in nature. So it was a question of selling the weapons. Ideological dimension was, of course, present, as in the case of the People's Front of Liberating Palestine or other organizations, because in their activity they also supported Marxism. It was also fighting against Israel, but with a socialist system. So this cooperation level of cooperation was different. But the business relations were not going so well. So next is the international dimension, because all countries from the Western Bloc had a corridor and back channel cooperation with the Palestinians and other People's Front of Liberation, but these contacts were not shared. Officially, that cooperation, counter-terrorist cooperation, was going very well between Warsaw, Prague, Western Berlin, or Moscow. But as we know from the studies and research that is being conducted, Stasi did not boast that they are hosting terrorists on their territories. Bulgarians did not boast that they have contact with Nidal, but the Soviet Union did not inform about any of their relations, operational or intelligence cooperations with those organizations. So there was, let's say, this kind of silence, veil of silence, but the cooperation was actually official veil of silence, but cooperation was going very well. So supporting Palestinians was also very relevant in the context of supporting a resolution of the UN in the 1975, which recognized Zionism as an expression of racism. So that resolution was, of course, supported. And there are many other threads. This is one digression where you can indicate that the embassy of Syria was established in 1969. And from the documentation, it was indicated that it was only after the March events in Warsaw when the communist authorities threw out or deported several thousand Poles of Jewish descent. And here, at a certain moment, this anti-Semitism represented by the Polish communist authorities was an encouragement for Arab states and Arab countries to come closer to the Polish People's Republic, both in economic, political, ideological, and to tighten those ties. One of the last reasons for which the PPR representatives maintained relations with terrorist organizations was intelligence. So Western countries and those services, intelligence services, as well as those on the other side of the Iron Curtain, maintained these intelligence operations under cover of various types of organizations, of messenger agents, in order to identify on time, or informants, to identify in time any kind of terrorist attacks. For example, both the military as well as civilian had contacts with the Palestinian Liberation Front or Hezbollah representatives or Abu Nidal. Of course, these relations did not have a kind of formal nature or character, but thanks to these individual meetings or systematic, there were certain information that was gained, which was then reported in Warsaw. So this kind of reconnaissance and intelligent aspect is very important in order to understand why Polish authorities of communist authorities, especially, and intelligence maintained relations with terrorist organizations and also gained benefit from those relations. Thank you very much.